Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you. I had a moment of panic when I wondered if the microphone I walked into the restroom with was still on. Laughter. It wasn't. February 8, 2003, they're in Neverland. They had arrived in Neverland on the 7th. Janet Arviso was never told she was going to Neverland. She was never told anything in terms of what was going to be happening to her and her family from that point on. On the 8th of February, they were joined by Mark Garrigus, by the entire 60 Minutes news crew, including Ed Bradley. Janet Arviso and the children were there. Dieter and Ronald were there. One of them was there at that time, the other one arrived later, I don't remember which. Frank Cassio was there. Michael Jackson was there. The boys at that point were staying with Michael Jackson. And that began 5 weeks of the boys staying with Michael Jackson, except for those periods of time that he was gone, the brief period of time that they were in Los Angeles when Janet finally grabbed them and left, and the period of time that they were at the Calabasas Hotel, the Country Inn and Suites in Calabasas while they were getting all the arrangements done for their departure for Brazil. Keep in mind, barely 5 days earlier, Janet Arviso was minding her own business in her own home, with her children healthy, all healthy children, and in a new relationship that ultimately ended up in a marriage. At this point, 5 days later, they're planning on sending her to Brazil. She was at Neverland over the next 5 days. Did not return home during that time. During that period of time, she worked with the two Germans, Ronald and Dieter. They prepared for this video that they were going to be doing. They were briefing her on what she needed to be saying. They were coaching her on what she needed to be saying. The boys more and more were separated from her. They were staying with Michael Jackson in his room during that period of time. Once again, she was being encouraged to believe that outside of Neverland was a danger situation for her children. And once again, the threats became more oppressive. They are now no longer against just Gavin, but they were threats against Gavin, his brother, his sister, and in fact the threats have extended to Janet herself and to her parents. They were no longer just threats that there were people out there who would cause her harm, crazed fans, sort of an obscure sort of person that nobody could quite describe. But, in fact, at this point there were threats that specifically were coming from the two Germans in terms of, we know where your parents live. We can make people disappear. She had enough by the early morning hours of the 12th. She had enough by the early morning hours of the 12th. At 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, she finally went to Jesus Salas, who was the house manager at that time, and speaking in Spanish with him, she asked him to please take her home, and the kids home. Janet Arviso, for all of her shortcomings, understood that Neverland is not the place to have her children long-term. That might be nice for a day visit. But it's not where you want to have children long-term. She grabbed her kids, they got in the car with Jesus Salas, and he drove them to her mother's house in El Monte. Now, that began a whole series of events that took place at that point. This was on the 12th when they finally took off. But there were immediately a whole collection of telephone calls that next day. Now, granted, understand this was the early morning hours of the 12th. By the time the 12th was done with, look what was going on in terms of telephone calls. 38 separate telephone calls between Frank Cassio and Mark Schaffel. 38 separate phone calls. There are 2 calls between Mark Garrigus and Brad Miller. And 3 between Brad Miller and Mark Schaffel. There were 3 phone calls between Frank Cassio and Mark Garrigus. There was 1 3-way phone call between Mark Garrigus, Brad Miller and Mark Schaffel. But look at the collection of calls, 19, between Frank Cassio and Vincent Amen. What is going on? 38 telephone conversations between Frank Cassio and Mark Schaffel. 38. What is going on at this point? The answer is, they escaped. Literally escaped, as preposterous as that sounds. Who would want to escape from Neverland? But they did. She grabbed her kids, and at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, they got out of there. And immediately what this entire collection of people, all working for and around Mark Garrigus and Frank Cassio and Mark Schaffel, all realized that this was a very difficult situation and even dangerous situation for them, because they needed to produce this video, because this video was going to be contained in the Take 2 program that was going to be shown in just a few days. I believe it was on the 21st, late at night, that performance was going to be shown on Fox Television, Fox Studios. There was a tremendous amount of money riding on all of this, and their expectation and their promotion was that Janet Arviso was going to be part of this production, and now she left. On the 13th, the very next day, a series, again, of phone calls. 4 between Mark Schaffel and Mark Garrigus. 4 Between Mark Garrigus and Ann Kite. Mark Garrigus's answer to every question I asked him, every single one, about the content of any telephone conversation that he had with anyone was, I don't really recall. I was kind of in the dark on all of this. On the 19th, over that period of time, a whole collection of telephone calls as they lead to the filming. But before we get to this, let me talk a little bit about what happened in that in-between period of time. Janet Arviso was the recipient of many telephone calls from Frank Cassio. Many of them. And in the course of one or more of those conversations, there was a tape recording made. That tape recording was made by Frank Cassio. Excuse me, that tape recording was of a telephone call involving Frank Cassio, but it was made by Brad Miller. And we recovered it when we searched Brad Miller's office and seized that tape recording. There was an expert who testified, a man who came from the Los Angeles area, works in the aerospace industry, and who also does work analyzing tape recordings to determine authenticity. His testimony to you was that tape, which goes over 20 minutes, it's 20 plus minutes, that tape was, in all likelihood, a second-generation tape, and in fact there were 34 breaks in that tape. In other words, somebody started and stopped that tape 34 times. Well, the somebody is Brad Miller. It's not likely to be anybody else under the circumstances. Mark Garrigus told you that telephone call was tape recorded because they were certain at that point that Janet Arviso was going to shake them down for money. In other words, it was going to be in that telephone conversation that there was going to be the demand by Janet Arviso that they pay money. That statement was not true. When he testified to that, he was not giving you truthful testimony. There was never the expectation by either Mark Garrigus or Brad Miller or Frank Cassio that Janet Arviso would ever ask for a penny in the course of that conversation. And you can tell by the nature of the conversation. If this was a conversation where they were going to be talking about a shakedown, then that conversation would have begun with Frank Cassio saying to Janet Arviso, "All right. You asked for $1 million in a numbered account in the Cayman Islands, let's talk about that. What do we get if we give you $1 million in a numbered account in the Cayman Islands?" That's what that conversation would begin with. This conversation was very different. I'd like you to go to that. These are either a series of telephone conversations or a single telephone conversation that had been edited 34 times. It may be more than one conversation. It may be many. We don't know. Brad Miller didn't testify in this case. The first thing that she begins to talk about is the Germans. Frank. What happened? Janet. It's just those German people. You don't imagine. Janet. Those people terrify me, Frank. They were threatening. They were terrifying. Frank. Like I said, you don't like I said, I promise you, Janet, you don't have to talk to them anymore. Janet. Because they were trying to dictate to me exactly what to say. Janet. Are the German guys there? Frank. No, don't worry. And if they're not there. And if they are, they're not there, I know that for a fact. But if they are, you don't have to talk to them. You just talk, it's unsafe. This came up continuously in the course of this telephone conversation between the two of them. Frank. Let us take care of you. Let us protect you. Now is not the right time to be out there alone. Frank. No, that's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried because you end the protection, because there's a lot of evil people out there right now. Frank. That's why even staying another night alone is not safe, so I want to talk to Gavin and see if he's okay, but then I want to talk to you and we can make some arrangements. Frank. And when you left like that, it was just so dangerous, and we were so worried about you. Frank. I'm going to get you guys out of there into a safe place tonight. I need you to be safe, and I need your family to be safe. Janet says, okay. Frank says, to you and to your family, because you know how vindictive people can be. Now, Janet Arviso came into this courtroom and told you that over and over and over they were telling her it was very dangerous outside of Neverland. And that she, in fact, had to be at Neverland. She had no way of knowing that this conversation was being tape recorded. She was never told that. She had no way of knowing that we would someday recover that tape recording. This corroborates her testimony 100%. Janet doesn't want money. Remember, this was the whole purpose of tape recording this telephone call, according to Mark Garrigus. This was the telephone call where Janet was going to make a demand for money. Don't worry, Frank, I can't be bought. Remember when she says that in there? We have no idea what they cut out of this tape recording, but this is the part that they left in. This is exactly the opposite of what is the pretense for them tape recording this telephone call in the first place. Don't worry, Frank, I can't be bought. Janet says, like, crazy here. Frank says, who? Janet says, the reporters and stuff. And we haven't talked to a single person, Frank. She can talk to anybody she wants. This is America. If she wants to sell her story, she can sell her story. And what is she doing? She's not talking to anybody. She's not accepting any offer, and there are offers abound. And, Frank, my mom's table is filled with offers and stuff like that. And I didn't take a single penny, is what she says to Frank. They're recording this conversation. There are parts that they are cutting out, but this they don't cut out. She goes on. It's like crazy. Can I read you one of the letters? It's like all kinds of things and it's of no interest to me, because family never leaves family behind, This is Janet. This is Janet telling Frank that her biggest concern is friends and family. She has no interest at all in profiting off Michael Jackson. Once again, she has never asked for a penny from Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's statements, now listen to this. This is all from Frank, the person who is quite possibly the closest person at Neverland. The closest person among Michael Jackson's entire entourage is Frank Cassio, and look what he says, Michael would love to see you. He is so worried. Michael cares about you and your family, entire family, and we would not mislead you. Michael has been missing you. Michael wants to see you. He didn't know what happened. He thought he did something and he was trying to get in touch with you. And I said, don't worry, I'll take care of this. Frank. We didn't know that, where you went. Michael didn't know. Nobody knew anything. I know Michael would love for you to come back to the ranch. Look at that. I know Michael would love for you to come back to the ranch. Who is it who's trying to get this family back at Neverland? Who is exploiting whom here? You need to go back up to the ranch and see Michael because he's very concerned. He's concerned about you and Gavin and Star and your daughter. The trip. Now, this part is pretty interesting, because you get a sense here as to what exactly it is that they may have cut out. Understand that they don't want anybody to know about this Brazil trip. But look what the statements are here. Frank. Michael. We were all going to go away. And this includes Michael Jackson, is his representation to her. Exactly consistent with her testimony, exactly consistent with what she said in the interviews. This is a trip to Brazil and Michael Jackson is personally coming as well. Michael, we are all going to go away. We are actually going to take you to a really great place that I was going to take you first, and Michael and the rest of them was going to come join us. For the safety of everyone, and trust me, where are you going to go? You're going to have an unbelievable time. I'm going to take you dancing every single night. Remember her response to that? She said, oh, that's okay, Frank. I just want you guys hugs. Janet Arviso has never asked for anything other than friendship and compassion. Ever. Frank. I'm going to just let you and Michael, we're all going to have to go someplace, including Michael, from what's going on, and it's going to be a fun trip. Even my brother and sister are going to be coming out. In the course of that telephone call, she never makes a demand for a single penny. In the course of that telephone call, there was never an offer of a single penny. And in the course of that telephone call she assures Frank she doesn't want money, has never asked for money, is not going to sell her story, is not going to say anything bad about Michael Jackson at all. They stayed together. She stays in Los Angeles until the 19th. She finally makes the determination that she is going to do the video. They are desperate at this point with regards to the video. They are desperate because they want this thing prepared and done and completed in time for the production that's going to take place. Frank. But one thing I would love for you to do, and this would really help Michael, if you could tell your story, because you know this whole documentary we're dealing, and this is, like I said, you don't have to talk to the Germans. You don't have to do anything. We would love for you to go tape and just say something beautiful about Michael. Because they are trying to dictate. And here's her answer. Listen to this. Because they are trying to dictate to me what exactly to say. That is exactly what she's been complaining about all along. She has no trouble saying a few good words about Michael Jackson. Up to this point, she has had not one reason in the world to be angry or upset with him, other than what she saw on the plane of him licking the head, and she had no idea what that was all about. Other than that, there was no reason to be upset with Michael Jackson, nor did she ever express it. When asked if she would say good words about him, she said, fine. She was upset with the Germans and how they were behaving and what they were telling her about the danger to her and her children and what they were saying about what she had to say. But you know? I know there are things and the way doing. They were going to take you down to see me, actually, because we were going to do the whole interview the next day, remember? But, listen, you don't ever have to deal with them again. That was the conversation that took place. She went back. She made the determination she still wasn't going back to Neverland. She caused them to have to move that interview to Hamid Mosley's house in Calabasas. And at that point that interview took place there. In the course of that interview, she had that conversation with Vicky Podboreski. That conversation was limited entirely to the concerns that she would have the following morning when she had to address Child Protective Services. She gave that interview. It was well over the top. She was filled with praise for Michael Jackson, praise for things he never did, and praise for things he did do. That business of helping the kids with their homework and spending time and curing her son of cancer, stuff that he obviously didn't do. But she did what was asked of her, and she did it for a variety of different reasons. 1. She liked Michael Jackson and was happy to do that for him. 2. She believed them when they said, "You have to do this to protect the well-being of your children." And 3. She believed that there was a correlation between what she said in that interview and ultimately whether her children would be taken away from her. She understood that if she made sure the child protective workers understood that Michael Jackson was a decent and loving man who was protecting her children and helping her children, and not causing harm for her children, that she would be able to keep her children. And that was her motivation as she went through that next thing. From the 21st to the 25th, they went about the efforts. They went back to Neverland, the entire family. These kids have now been at Neverland or out of school or in the presence of Michael Jackson since the 5th of February. It is now between the 21st and the 25th, and all of them have been staying at Neverland. On the 25th, they go to Calabasas, they stay in Calabasas. And let me go back just one moment, and I'll move back to Calabasas again. What you see here is Exhibit 413, and this is the consent and release agreement. Remember Mr. Mesereau telling that she was negotiating for more money? Well, this was the agreement that was originally furnished to her that she did not sign. This is the one that she did sign. As you can see, there was no offer of money in any way. She has never asked for money. They never gave her money. This simply released her and allowed them to be able to use her image, to be able to profit from it. The second release is the one that waives rights on behalf of her children, as well. So that they can use the image of her children in this production. That she asked for no money in any of this, has never asked for any money in any of this at all. During the period of time between the 25th, the period of time between the 25th and the 2nd of March, Janet Arviso and the kids stayed at a hotel in Calabasas. She had at this point reconciled herself to the fact that she was heading off to Brazil. She had had the interview with the Child Protective Services. That interview was tape recorded. It was tape recorded until she turned the tape off, because she believed that the tape recording was illegal. That tape recording was done by an employee of Mark. An employee of Brad Miller, the private investigator who worked for Mark Garrigus. Mark Garrigus told you he knew nothing about it. That is probably unbelievable. Of course, he told you he knew nothing about anything, and we'll get to Mark Garrigus a little bit further on. That tape recording was made and it eventually ended up on television. Ultimately we received a copy of that tape recording from the defense, and that was the copy that was played for you, in its entirety, until she finally turned that tape recording off. Between the 25th and the 2nd, the 25th of February and the 2nd of March, they made the arrangements to go to Brazil. She obviously at this point agreed that she was going to go to Brazil. She was never happy about it under any circumstances. And why would she be? She had a child who was sick and needed continuous medical attention. She was scared. She was worried. She was in a new relationship. She didn't trust the people who were dictating what was going on in her life at this point. But she was convinced that she needed to leave the country at that point. They got passports, they got visas, they got her birth certificate. They got the court records that showed that she had sole custody of her children, custody having been taken away from her ex-husband, David Arviso. They took them shopping. They got new clothes for this trip. They got luggage for her to be able to pack all of this stuff. And they were making the arrangements to go. They went back to Neverland on the 2nd of March, and guess who returned to Neverland at exactly that time? Michael Jackson. And you'll see from the heir apparent records that he had actually flown his family from Neverland out to Florida the very day before, leaving the family behind in Florida. He then returned back to Neverland on the 2nd of March, as he was then reunited after this 5-day absence with Gavin and Star. Gavin and Star both go back into his bedroom during that period of time. During that period of time, they stayed in his bedroom the entire time from the 2nd of March to the 10th of March, with the exception of 2 nights. There were 2 nights that Michael Jackson went to a hotel in Los Angeles. Excuse me. That was the night of the 7th and the night of the 8th. Other than that, these boys were in Michael Jackson's bedroom the entire time. It was during this period of time that the behavior had turned to something horribly illegal. On the 9th of March, Janet Arviso had her child begin the collection of a 24-hour sample, urine sample, for a creatinine testing at Kaiser Hospital. Gavin was still under the care of a doctor, and receiving regular appointments and regular checkups. Once again, the reason why she would not pick up and simply move this family to Brazil. The urine collection was the 24-hour urine collection that was put in a large container and it would be taken to the hospital for the test. In the morning hours of the 10th of March, she received a telephone call from her son Gavin, 4 o'clock in the morning. And he explained to her for the first time that Michael Jackson was giving them alcohol. And he was worried because this test, as Gavin had told Michael Jackson came to believe that this test would reveal that the children were given alcohol and could cause problems for him. Michael Jackson wanted Gavin to throw it away and cancel the test. And he, in fact, wouldn't do that. Janet Arviso was very upset at hearing this, very concerned about hearing this. This is the first time that she had ever expressed anything negative about Michael Jackson. That he would give her child, who had suffered from cancer, who suffers still from an immune deficiency problem because of that. Alcohol was just unspeakable for her. And she sent her daughter Devaline to the house at 6 o'clock in the morning to gain entry, to get Gavin, to get them out so that they could leave. Devaline pounded on the door. There was no response, no answer. Remember Macaulay Culkin talking about Michael Jackson has an open door policy? Well, apparently not on that day. She wasn't able to rouse anybody. It wasn't until much later that morning that she finally arranged with Vinny and Gavin that they were going to go to the Kaiser Hospital. On the way to Kaiser Hospital there was a stop. She used a restroom. When she came back in, the urine had been spilled. Vinny spilled out the urine. Said it was an accident. Spilled out the urine. There wasn't a sufficient quantity to test. There was no blood test that was done at that time either. But Janet at this point knew that there was a serious problem. And I want you to think about something. From the moment that Janet Arviso understood that Michael Jackson posed a direct threat to her child, and this was not molestation. That wasn't what she was thinking. It was alcohol being furnished to a child who was sick and still undergoing medical attention. From the moment she learned that, 36 hours later, her children were out of Neverland and never went back. 36 hours. Contrast that against Liz Barnes, who allowed her child to sleep in Michael Jackson's bed for over a year. Contrast that against Joy Robson, who took thousands of dollars from Michael Jackson and allowed her child to spend months at a time in that bedroom. Contrast that even against June Chandler, who today understands what she did wrong. And today regrets the fact that she has even lost her child because of his association with Michael Jackson. But who also allowed Michael Jackson to spend months in bed, in her own house, in bed with her son at age 13. For all her shortcomings, Janet Arviso, within 36 hours of learning that Michael Jackson was giving her child alcohol, had all 3 of her kids out of Neverland and they never went back. And that was amid a great deal of pressure from a lot of very highly paid people during that period of time. On the 10th, when she went to the hospital to furnish the sample of urine, she made this ruse about going to a beauty parlor in West LA, and in that beauty parlor she called Jay Jackson. Jay Jackson came. She said she was not going back to the ranch. They took Gavin back to the ranch. On the next day she had a court appearance, on the 11th. They went to that court appearance. Vinny was supposed to bring the kids. Vinny came. He never brought the kids. That next day was the 11th. They understood very clearly that they had to get the kids out of there, and that began the process of doing so. They then hatched a plot with her mother, Maria Ventura, who you met. You heard her testimony. Again, use common sense. Is she making all of that stuff up? You saw her demeanor, you heard the words out of her mouth as it was translated to you. The testimony was in Spanish. But they had to use a ploy to be able to get those kids delivered from Neverland over to their house. And they were delivered there. And they never went back. And Maria Ventura's testimony to you was that she did not even recognize these children by the time they got back. And certainly she did not recognize Gavin. Angry, hostile, confrontational, very upset that he had been taken away from Neverland during that period of time. Very upset. She testified to you that even today he is not the same child that he was before he met Michael Jackson. What happened at Neverland during that period of time? I mean, what was going on at Neverland when they were there? Well, you need to understand a little bit of what the grooming process is. What happens to a child who is exposed to a predator, and particularly a predator who has a great deal of money and a great deal of influence over children, and has the ability, because of his reputation and his position, not in the community, but the international community as a celebrity, to be able to work with children in ways that nobody else can possibly imagine? The first thing that begins with children at Neverland is that they're separated from their parents, and they're separated from authority, and they are separated from discipline. During the 5 weeks that these children were exposed to Michael Jackson, they've had no schooling. They had no homework. They had no discipline. Their mother, when she was there, basically stayed in her room. The kids stayed with Michael Jackson. They ran free. They did whatever they wanted to do. They played all of the games that are in Neverland. They rode on the rides. They drove the golf carts around. They drove the quads. They went to the zoo. They ate whatever they wanted, which for a 12 and 13-year-old means candy. They ate enormous amounts of sugar, candy, ice cream, soda pop, whenever they wanted. When they didn't want to eat, they didn't eat. There was no discipline, there was only fun. They played with video games, and they were clearly the best video games that had ever been invented. They played with all manner of toys. They watched movies. They did whatever they wanted to do during the course of the day. And at night, they entered into the world of the forbidden. At night they went into Michael Jackson's room, which is a veritable fortress. It is a room that nobody else has access to. It is a room that has codes and locks and multiple doors and alarm systems, and they knew all of those alarm systems and all of those codes, and they stayed there, and they knew all of that information because Michael Jackson wanted them to know all of that information. And inside that room, in the evening time, they entered the world of the forbidden and they learned about human sexuality from somebody who is only too willing to be their teacher. And that discussion began with looking at magazines, looking at pornography, looking at a collection of sexually explicit material. It began with very frank discussions about sexuality designed to reduce their inhibitions. It began with discussions about masturbation. It began with discussions about nudity. It included a presentation by himself, nude, to them, to these children. It included an act of simulating a sex act on a mannequin that was up in the room. Now, again, I ask you, Mr. Mesereau is going to say these kids made all of this up and they made all of this up at the behest of Janet Arviso. And when he says that to you, you need to ask yourself, does common sense suggest that that's how it happened, when we find a mannequin in that room, exactly the mannequin that they talked about 9 months later? Janet was never up in that room. Does that make sense that they would find this thing that corroborates the testimony of these boys so well when they talk about him presenting himself nude? Who made that up? It simply has the ring of truth to it. And as you apply your common sense to this evidence, you see that that's true, particularly given the wealth of poverty, of pornography that is found in that room. Not just that room but in other places at Neverland as well, something that clearly all of them understand. The grooming process takes a while. It takes a while. Not a terribly long while, but a while. And it begins with the selection of a vulnerable child, because a child who comes from a healthy household with two loving parents who are watching carefully over their children, is a much harder hold to get a foothold in for a predator than would be a child from a broken home with only one parent, and with one parent who deals with her own collection of disabilities. That is a much more vulnerable home. And when you look at all the other kids, you will realize that there's a common theme with all of them. There's no father in the picture in virtually all of them. In the Barnes family, in the Robson family. There was no child, sick, in the Chandler family. There was no father in the picture. Jason Francia, there was no father in the picture. And at this point, there was no father in the picture for Gavin Arviso either. And in the case of their mother, as well-meaning as she was, this is a person who had endured 16 or 17 years of domestic violence, and an additional year of watching her son almost die, and she simply lacked the emotional wherewithal to be able to deal with all that was going on at Neverland, as hard as she tried. And even given her limited sophistication and understanding, she still, more than any of the others, understood that Neverland was not the place for her children to be, and she battled valiantly to get those kids the heck out of there. So what happened over that particular period of time? Well, the vulnerable child is the one who simply doesn't have the protection. A colleague of mine uses the expression, he says, the lion on the Serengeti doesn't go after the strongest antelope. The lion on the Serengeti goes after the weakest antelope. All predators go after the weakest, not the strongest. To distinguish the weakest in terms of children is the level of protection their parents are able or unable to afford. And in this case, this was the vulnerable child. Now, Gavin stood up here, at age 15, and he testified for you. This is why we thought it was so important that you see the actual disclosure in the tape when he was 13 years old, and for the first time disclosed to Steve Roble what had happened to him. But as he stood up here at age 15, think about this for a moment. He stood before you at age 15 and in a room that's filled with people. It was filled with people back then. There's 20 jurors sitting in this box. There's a collection of people sitting up here, and there's Michael Jackson, the man that he once held in such high regard, the man that he loved, the man that he spent endless nights in bed with in the most intimate manner possible. And he stood up here, at age 15, in a room filled with people, and there's no question that the people out there, a good number of them, are press, national press. He knew that his words were going to be showing up everywhere. It is a large collection of people out there. That had to be intimidating for him. It's intimidating for me. You look out there, there are faces out there you recognize. Some of them I even like. Laughter. What would it have been like for a 15-year-old child? And talking about what? Talking about the most sensitive subject matter possible. The fact that he had been molested by a man he once loved. A man he held in very high regard. And he plugged through it. And he talked about what happened. And he talked about this entire process of, over a period of weeks, being shown sexually graphic material, being talked to about intimate sexual matters, being oriented into the world of sexuality at age 13, and sharing a bed with him. And finally he described to you an act of lying in bed, drinking, having been drinking on numerous occasions, drinking every night to a point of intoxication, and he described to you 2 events that he said he was sober enough to be able to give descriptions with some level of accuracy. He believed that there were more events, but those were 2 that he was able to describe to you. And he described the defendant lying in bed with him and reaching his hand into his pajama bottoms and fondling his genitalia, and at least on one occasion to the point where he ejaculated. And he described that, a 15-year-old boy. All of you have known or know a 15-year-old boy. And you have got to understand that that may be probably the second most difficult moment in his life. The first most difficult moment was that moment you saw on tape as he sat with Steve Roble and for the first time ever disclosed what happened to him. That has got to be a difficult moment. And yet we are supposed to believe that what he said was all made up, because there's some expectation that in the future he would become a wealthy person. This is a 15-year-old child. All of you have dealt with children at one time or the other. All of you understand that the expectation of telling a child, do this for me now, and in 2 weeks, something good will happen for you, that the response that you get from that teenager is something along the line of, whatever. That it is almost impossible to assure from a child that they will receive some expectation of gratitude or appreciation of something that will happen at some time down the line. The suggestion that this child should subject himself to the humiliation of this kind of an ordeal and the ordeal of going through that interview with Steve Roble that you watched, and you watched that twisted response of a small child having to disclose for the first time those kinds of words at age 13. The suggestion that all of this was planned and plotted and it was simply nothing more than a shakedown, a good acting job, is nonsense. It's unmitigated rubbish. You cannot do that to a child. It would be impossible to do, even if he was motivated to do it, and he wasn't. And he wasn't. Would you go to the experts, please, Katz? Now, there were a number of witnesses who testified in this proceeding. And I'm going to be quoting Stan Katz at this moment, who is of course the person who was retained by Larry Feldman to evaluate these children at the time. These are questions that he answered. A pre-adolescent or adolescent boy is hypersensitive about his sexuality. It would be extremely unusual for a child who's developmentally at a stage where he's trying to figure out who he is, and to actually become a man, to make an allegation which would suggest that he's had inappropriate sexual relationships with a male. This is somebody who has been doing this for many years and has the reputation of being conservative in his determinations that sexual molestation took place. It would be extremely rare, because these children are so protective and so guilt-ridden and shamed by any behavior that's extraordinary and ultra-normal. In my experience, a child who is going to lie and fabricate cannot be consistent and hold that very long, because children are impulsive. They can't delay gratification. You can't tell a child, years from now, if you lie, something good will happen. Alright, now, Stan Katz obviously was a witness who was hired by Mr. Feldman. There is every expectation that Mr. Mesereau will say, well, he's biased in his view. He was paid by Feldman. Obviously he's on one side. But let's look at some of the comments, if we could, by Dr. Esplin. Dr. Esplin was, of course, the expert who was retained by the defense, who was called by Mr. Sanger. And look at a number of the questions that he answered to. Alright, doctor, in terms of disclosures, you agree with Dr. Urquiza. Dr. Urquiza testified for the prosecution. You agree with Dr. Urquiza that you really can't draw any conclusion from a child reporting late. Isn't that true? Yes. And you would agree with Dr. Urquiza when he says that the time and even the manner in which one discloses is not necessarily reflective of the truth of the allegation? And he says, yes. And in fact, children often report in piecemeal. They give a little information now, and a little information later, and more information after that. Would that be true? That's not unusual? And his answer is, I would agree with that, but you're talking about that they don't tell you everything there is to tell on the initial disclosure. Dr. Esplin was the retained expert for the defense who testified, and as I started asking him questions about what might you logically see in the case of the consenting victim, the victim who's in a relationship with the offender, not one who's abducted off the street, but one who is in a consenting relationship with the defendant, with the suspect, one who has been groomed to be able to behave appropriately, because you need to understand, it's not that hard to molest a child. What's hard is getting away with it. In other words, you need to develop the relationship where you have the confidence that the child will not reveal what's going on, that the child will accept what's going on. Sometimes that the child will even enjoy engaging in acts that a 13-year-old would otherwise find repulsive, and you do that by developing a relationship. Befriending a non-related child, spending a great deal of time with a non-related child, providing the child with extravagant gifts or money. In this case, that child had been given not just extravagant gifts or money, but gifts that are personal to the defendant. The jacket off of his back, a watch off of his wrist, a watch that he represents as worth $75,000. I don't know anything about expensive watches. That one looks a lot less than that, but that's what he represented to Gavin at the time. That's a watch worth $75,000. Taking the child to fun places. Doing fun things. This is Dr. Esplin, their own witness. What could be more fun than everything that is Neverland? Bestowing special privileges. Shares intimate moments. What could be more intimate than going to bed with a person night after night after night, but staying in the same room, sequestered in his suite, locked away from the rest of the world, even locked away from the rest of Neverland? Gavin Arviso as the child in the upper left. Brett Barnes as the child in the upper right. Jordy Chandler as the child on the lower left. And on the lower right is Jason Francia. I want to talk to you now about some of the corroboration that we've presented in this particular case. There was a collection of testimony from different witnesses who came before you, and I'm going to start with Jason Francia. Jason Francia today is 24 years old. I apologize, I have a bit of a cold. But I'll get through this, okay? Jason Francia today is 24 years old. He is very actively involved in his church. When he was 10 years old, he was molested by Michael Jackson. In fact, he had been molested on 2 previous occasions by Michael Jackson. On the first of those occasions, which could date back as young as age 7, Mr. Jackson fondled his genitalia on the outside of his clothing. That happened a second time. And then finally on the third occasion, when he was about 10 years old, it was by putting his hand on the inside of his shorts up through the leg and fondling his genitalia, skin to skin. That event occurred when he was about 10. He was the son of a maid who worked for Michael Jackson. Today, he's 24 years old. This was disclosed when he was 13. It was disclosed in conjunction with the investigation that took place surrounding the allegations about Jordy Chandler in the civil suit that was filed by Larry Feldman on behalf of Jordan Chandler back in 1993 and 1994. Jason Francia went through 5 years of therapy after the resolution of their civil case in his favor. Over 5 years, up until age of 18, and at the age of 18, he stopped his therapy, and he went and became involved with his church. Over the next 6 years, he went through a program, an apprenticeship program to become a youth pastor at that church, and today is a youth pastor, but as well as the director of a youth mentorship program at that church. In other words, they take at-risk children, and they work with them to show them that there are alternatives to being involved with gangs, to being involved with drugs, to being involved with criminal behavior. And as he said it to you, one of the alternatives is the discovery of God. There is absolutely no reason to believe that Jason Francia has anything to gain by coming into this courtroom and testifying about what happened to him when he was 10 years old and when he was younger. Not only does he have nothing personal to gain by it, he is not selling his story. He is not going to a tabloid. He has never sold his story. He has never gone to a tabloid. The civil claim that was settled back when he was 13 years old had nothing to do with him. Nobody asked his permission or his involvement. He had no idea that his mother had sold her story for $20,000 until just days before he walked into the courtroom. Jason Francia appears to be the kind of young man you want living next door to you. He is a delightful young person, and there's just no indication that there's anything about his personality or character that could be defined in any way other than absolutely beyond reproach, a man of impeccable character and integrity. He came into this courtroom and he testified that he was molested by Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson paid money to his mother and to him to settle that claim against him, as did he do for Jordy Chandler. Very favorably resolved, as Mr. Feldman said. If you believe that Jason Francia testified truthfully as he testified before you, then Michael Jackson is a child molester. If you believe that his testimony is truthful, and you have no reason in the world not to believe it, it's corroborated by the fact that Michael Jackson paid this kid off, and the mother, and it's corroborated by the fact that, frankly, the testimony of Gavin himself. But it is mostly corroborated by this child himself, whose presentation before you was absolutely sincere and painful. You watched him struggle through his testimony in very much the same way that Gavin struggled through his, both on that video and in court as well. This is not an easy subject for an adolescent boy, and it doesn't get easier when they get into their 20s. He testified to you that he never told his mother. To this day he has never told his mother. Gavin told you exactly the same thing. He has never told his mother what happened. Jason Francia told you on the witness stand that he never told his wife he had just married within the last month before the testimony, that she was hearing it for the first time sitting in the courtroom. This is not the type of thing that adolescent boys talk about or disclose. It is not easy. The suggestion that his testimony was contrived and part of a plot to shake down a celebrity is nonsense. You'll notice they never accused Chris Tucker of anything. They never accused George Lopez of anything. There were a variety of celebrities that they were exposed to when Gavin was sick. None of them have ever been the recipient of any accusation whatsoever. June Chandler testified in this particular case. June Chandler testified that her child was saturated with telephone calls. Many telephone calls over a long period of time, long calls going hours. Exactly what Gavin said. This is what he does. This is how he begins his relationship. June Chandler testified that they went on trips together. They traveled to Las Vegas. They traveled to Monaco. They traveled to Paris. They traveled to New York. They traveled to Florida together. This whole family. He took them many, many places. June Chandler testified that he gave the mother a diamond Cartier bracelet. June Chandler testified that she got a gift certificate from Michael Jackson from Fred Siegel, a higher-end clothing store in Los Angeles, $7,000. And what was his relationship with her child? While he was whining and dining the family, and again there was no father in the picture during this time, he was coming to June Chandler's home every day at about 3 o'clock after school let out, and he would spend the balance of that day and night, with Jordy Chandler, the balance of the day and nights in his room, in his bed, until the next morning, when Jordy would go off to school and Michael Jackson would then leave and return at 3 o'clock the next day. This went on for weeks and weeks. It was at least 30 days that this was going on. And that doesn't count the period of time that they were traveling to places like Monaco and Paris and New York and Florida and Las Vegas during this period of time. June Chandler has lost her son as a consequence of this. She hasn't had a conversation or seen her son since he was 13 years old. When all of this came to light, the investigation occurred, he went to live with his father. There is no reason to disbelieve anything June Chandler said. In that lawsuit, she got a settlement as well, and that settlement was at the request of the defense, and it was at the request of the defense because it included within that settlement a provision that she not discuss any aspect of Michael Jackson or that settlement. That money that she got was to buy her silence, and it did until this came along. Ralph Chacon testified in this trial. Ralph Chacon testified that he saw Michael Jackson in a shower with Geordie Chandler. He believed that Geordie Chandler was young at the time. Both of them were nude. He saw it through the window into the shower. He saw Michael Jackson caressing his hair. He saw him kissing his head, kissing his face, once again kissing his head. Again corroboration of what Janet saw on the plane. He saw him kissing his mouth. He saw Michael Jackson with his hands all over Geordie's body, kissing his nipples, and then finally putting Geordie Chandler's penis in his mouth. He said he went back to the house at that time. He said he saw them leave the shower with the bathing suits left behind. He said he saw them leaving with Geordie Chandler up on Michael Jackson's shoulders wearing only a towel, obviously nothing else. The bathing suits had been left behind in the shower room. You saw a separate occasion of them standing in front of the Peter Pan display as Michael Jackson kissed him and ran his hands down his crotch. Ralph Chacon acknowledged that at a later time he was involved in a lawsuit. He lost that lawsuit. He declared bankruptcy. There was over $1 million judgment entered against him as a counterclaim by Michael Jackson, but you need to understand something. The disclosure of what he saw that day was made under oath, in testimony under oath, a year prior to that lawsuit taking place. It was made under oath after he had been contacted by attorneys representing the defendant, including Robert Sanger. And he refused at that time, to give statements to them. That testimony was done under oath well in advance of that matter. There was the testimony of Qasim Abdul. Qasim Abdul testified that he saw very much the same thing in terms of Geordie Chandler walking out of that shower on the shoulders wearing that towel. There was the testimony of Adrienne McManus. Adrienne McManus gave testimony that she saw Wade Robson being kissed by Michael Jackson with his hand on his buttocks. That she saw Brett Barnes in bed together with Michael Jackson, something Brett Barnes readily acknowledged. That she saw Macaulay Culkin being kissed on the cheek with a hand on his rear end. And that she saw Geordie Chandler being kissed on the cheek and then on the mouth and then with his hand on his crotch. She also filed a lawsuit against Michael Jackson. She was part of that one at a subsequent time. She lost that lawsuit. She's the only one who did not seek bankruptcy protection, and as a consequence, Michael Jackson has in the past garnished her salary. She comes here and she testified 10 years later, says the same thing. She's not going to get anything from this. She's not going to get a story sold, none of that. The only risk she runs is that her salary could still be garnished at some time in the future. Blanca Francia testified. She testified that she saw Wade Robson in the shower with Michael Jackson. His underwear was on the floor of the room. He was about 8 years old. She saw Wade and Macaulay spending days on end in Michael Jackson's bedroom. Philip Lamarck testified. And Philip Lamarck testified that they delivered French fries to the arcade, and while he was in there, he saw Michael Jackson holding up Macaulay Culkin. He saw his hand going underneath his shorts. And he saw his hand in the region of his crotch. Philip Lamarck's testimony directly corroborates both Jason Francia, and it directly corroborates as well Gavin Arviso. Now, what other corroboration do we have of the testimony of Jason Francia? Could I have the pictures of the magazines? There was a collection of material that was shown to you during the course of this trial. And, frankly, it took quite some time to show it to you, and I want to go through some of this material right now. This book up here, entitled, Man, A Sexual Study of Man, was found inside Mr. Jackson's bedroom. We had last night thought about presenting some of the photographs inside this book. And we decided, and understand, as you've seen in the course of this trial, we're not squeamish about showing photographs. We've done that. We could not find a photograph inside this manual that we felt could be projected on this wall. This is a detailed study of what two men are able to do to one another sexually. The two men are depicted in numerous photographs. The photographs are divided in 3 categories. A series of photographs of two men masturbating one another, the second category of two men performing oral sex on one another, and then the final chapter is two men performing acts of sodomy or anal sex on one another. The pictures are absolutely graphic. This is not a publication that you're going to find on anybody's coffee table. This is a publication that Michael Jackson had in his possession because it excites him. The content of this publication is sexual. And it is sexually exciting for him to have. That is the only reason somebody would have this type of publication. This is not appreciation of the content for its photographic sake. It is not appreciation of the content for its artistic sake. There is no artistic sake to it. It's graphic depictions of two men performing sex acts on them. You need to look at that book. You need to look at the content of that book. This is not possessed by him for any reason other than the fact that he finds sexual excitement in looking at them. And then you have to ask yourself, are you comfortable with a middle-aged man getting into bed with a 13-year-old boy as he possesses material like this that is, for him, sexually exciting? That's the question you have to deal with. The Boy, a photographic essay. This book was seized from Michael Jackson's possession in 1993. It is filled with photographs very much like this. Boys Will Be Boys is the other publication. It is filled with photographs just like this. All of the photographs in this publication are very much like this. Now, I will suggest again that there may be people who possess these because they find the photographs to be artistic. That's possible. But let me suggest to you that Michael Jackson possessed this book in 1993, at a time that he was sharing his bed, for months at a time, with one child after another. A succession of young boys going into his room for days and weeks and months at a time and sharing his bed in the most intimate manner possible. This was the kind of material that he had in his room at the time. He possessed this because it was sexually exciting for him, not because he thought that there was something good about the quality of the photography or because he considered that to be art. This is a book called Chronos that was found in his room as well. That is a description or an example of the photography in that book. Now, in his bedroom, when we went in there and we started opening drawers conducting our search, is a drawer that contains, just as you open the drawer, that is the magazine that you see that's in there. In that drawer, the testimony to you was also found photographs of the Arviso children. That picture of the Arviso children, with Devaline in her uniform as an LAPD cadet and the other two boys, was found in that drawer at that time. This was found in a box at the foot of the bed. Just like that. I mean, it may have been closed, but all you have to do is open it up. Remember the open door policy that Mr. Culkin talked about? Anybody could walk in there. His children walk in there. The people, the staff who walk in there and clean his room. It had to be the case that every single person who works at Neverland understands that he collects material like this. This is his bathroom on the first floor. Look at the, I didn't lose it. I didn't lose it. It's here. Right down here, that is a suitcase. Right there is the black suitcase. This is in his bathroom on the first floor. Anybody can walk into that bathroom at that time. Inside that suitcase was a number of different documents, including these magazines. Also, there was a contract that you received in evidence, a contract. I believe it was the Neverland Valley Entertainment. No. I don't remember which one. There's a contract that was in that suitcase at the time. This is some magazines that was found on the first floor near the bathroom. Go ahead. This was found in the bathroom, simply sitting up on the counter, pimp up, hose down, and then copies of Barely Legal. Go ahead to the next one. Guess what this is? This is the suitcase that Gavin told you about. This is the suitcase, or the briefcase that Gavin told law enforcement about. And Starr as well. Both of them said that there were magazines in there. They described some of the magazines. Some have been added to since then, some have been taken away. It is from this collection of magazines, from this collection, that we found all of the fingerprints. Go ahead to the next one. These are figurines that are found in his office. This is the office in the separate building that's connected by a breezeway. You walk in there, and they are on the desk. Again, his open door policy. Anybody in that ranch walks in there and sees this stuff, including his own children. He is simply not inhibited about hiding what he finds to be interesting sexually. Everybody on the ranch knows what's in there. His own witness, Maria, who testified, the maid, says she has seen the magazines. Go on to the next one. That's another one of the figurines. Next. This is inside the cabinet in the bathroom to the office. You just open the door, and that's what you see. Another copy of Barely Legal. I'm going to be talking about that publication in a moment. Next. Here is another drawer in the bathroom to the office. You just open the door, a bottle of Vaseline on the left and another pornographic magazine on the right. Go ahead to the next one. Alright. Now, the fingerprints that we presented over a great deal of time. I'm going to resolve this in less than 1 minute, alright? Because you already heard days and days of that. This is a collection of the magazines for which the fingerprints were found. You were exposed to hours of cross-examination of each of these witnesses as they talked about a fingerprint that was misidentified in Spain, okay? Or in Oregon, or in Philadelphia, or something like that. But the bottom line is that there were no experts who were presented by the defense to say that what we believed to be fingerprints of Starr or Gavin were, in fact, mistakes. They didn't do that. And these prints were given to them to analyze separately. So the bottom line is that these are their fingerprints. And by not producing evidence to the contrary is an acknowledgement that these are their fingerprints. As to Starr in the Green, there were fingerprints on one magazine called, Finally Legal. Look at the topics of these things. As to Gavin, there are fingerprints on a title, Barely Legal, Hardcore. And then there was another magazine, Visions of Fantasy, and another one's, Al Goldstein's 100 Best Adult Videos. One of those magazines actually went to the grand jury, and it was that one. Remember Mr. Sanger asking Paul Zealous on the witness stand, Detective Zealous, isn't it true all of these magazines were handed to the boys during the grand jury? And the answer is, no. Of all the magazines that we found fingerprints on, only one of them actually went to the grand jury. All the rest of them were in the possession of Charlene Marie, who testified. Charlene Marie is the criminalist from the Department of Justice, and all of those magazines during the period of the grand jury hearings were, in fact, in her possession. This is the mannequin that Janet testified to. The mannequin that, not Janet testified. I'm sorry, that Gavin and Starr testified that the defendant simulated a sex act against them at that time. Let me take a moment to talk to you. Let me take a moment to talk to you about the sexually explicit material that was in his home. It was probably in 3 categories of material. There were the 2 books, and others, that depict nude children. There was the collection of material that was homoerotic. Some of it extraordinarily graphic. There are about 5 or 6 publications that he had that contain homoerotic material. Some just photographs and some depicting sex acts in the extreme. And it's whatever 2 people, 2 men, can do to one another. Then there was a collection of heterosexual material, mostly in the form of magazines. The greatest collection of that material had titles like, Just Legal, or, Barely Legal. They are magazines that are selected, for whom models are selected because they are presumably 18 years old, but frankly look 14. Okay? And for all we know, they're 14 pretending to be 18 pretending to be 14, because there's no way of knowing what their true age is. Identification is easy to get a hold of. Why is he in possession of all of those magazines? Because he has 13-year-old boys in his room and 13-year-old boys who look at those magazines, and it's not an accident that that's where the fingerprints come up. It's not an accident. They did not go through his drawers and find it in that room. It's not an accident that that happened. They're going through that material because he's showing them that material, and the selection of those particular magazines are designed to appeal to a 13-year-old boy, who is exactly at that stage in his life, and looking through those pictures, he sees images of, what he sees are like girls that he knows and goes to school with. He's 13 years old, and these models are selected because, frankly, they look that age, or 14, or 15, but girls that he would be familiar with. That is sexually exciting to a child and that reduces his inhibitions. Why would he possess all of this material? Why would a man who has an interest in homoerotic material also have an interest in this kind of heterosexual material? And my answer to that question is, it's not for him. It's for the children who come into his room. The third area of corroboration that we're dealing with is the alcohol. There was a great deal of alcohol that was being poured at Neverland. He was drinking a lot of it, and the kids were drinking a lot of it. And we know it's true. Michael Jackson has a drinking problem. There's no other explanation to it. Jesus Salas described him as being intoxicated many nights a week. Not drinking many nights a week, intoxicated many nights a week. That corroborated the boys when they said he was intoxicated on a regular basis as well. Let's go to the jury instructions, if we can. We found bottles of alcohol in his room. There's no question but that he was drinking. We even have the testimony of his cousin, Riho Jackson, who said that while the boys were in his room, a bottle of wine was delivered to his room. I'm going to go through some of the instructions fairly rapidly and we're going to move on quickly. He's charged with 4 counts of lewd act with a child. That's counts 2, 3, 4 and 5. Counts 2 and 3 deal with acts of molestation as described by Gavin Arviso. Counts 4 and 5 deal with the acts of molestation as described by Starr Arviso. Go ahead. A lewd act with a child is. There are 3 elements to this offense. We have to establish that a person touched the body of a child was under 14 at the time, that the touching was done with the specific intent to arouse, appeal to, or gratify the lust, passions or sexual desires of either the person or the child. If there's any kind of touching of a child, it doesn't matter whether it's skin to skin, or skin on clothing, or otherwise. Any touching of a child under the age of 14 that is done because of the sexual interest, it's done because he finds it sexually satisfying to do, or he wants it to be sexually satisfying to the child. That is an act of child molestation as defined under 288a, which is the offense that we deal with. 4 counts. 2 counts separately as described by Gavin. 2 counts separately as described. On count 6 was an attempt of child molest. That was described by Gavin, and that was the incident where Michael Jackson took his hand and brought his hand toward his crotch intending him to fondle Michael Jackson. Gavin was not ready to do that. The grooming process had not yet extended far enough. He pulled his hand away. It's charged as an attempt, but that's that count. Attempt is a specific intent to commit the crime, and a direct but ineffectual act toward its commission. In other words, he took an act toward doing it, and he intended to do it at the time. That satisfies that crime. The final 4 counts deal with administration of an intoxicant to aid the commission of a felony. This is the final 4 counts, and each one reflects a correspondence with each of the child molestation counts. That the accused administered an intoxicating agent to another person. He did that every night while they were there. And, 2. The accused administered the intoxicating agent with the specific comment to thereby enable or assist him in committing a lewd act with the child. Conspiracy. Move through this. This conspiracy began as they were in Florida. This conspiracy began when they decided that they needed to get into the mind of Janet Arviso that she was in danger. A conspiracy is an agreement to commit a crime, a specific intent to commit the crime, a specific intent to commit that crime, the specific intent to commit an overt act in furtherance of that crime, all right? The agreement may be unspoken, and the agreement may be inferred from the circumstances. Now, what does this mean? 3 men get together and decide that they're going to rob a liquor store. One goes out and buys a gun, one goes out and gasses up the car, one goes out and selects which liquor store. All 3 of those acts are in furtherance of that conspiracy. The 3 men get together and they specifically say they're going to do that. You now have a crime of conspiracy to rob a liquor store. Does it matter that they did not rob the liquor store? No, not in the least. Conspiracy is what they call an inchoate crime, an incomplete crime. The crime is sufficient, there is something flying around. I'm not just doing that. The crime is sufficient when they get into the agreement that they're going to do it and one of them takes one step in furtherance of the commission of that crime. They are charged with conspiracy in this case. There were overt acts. Go ahead, a step or act committed by one or more of the co-conspirators which goes beyond mere planning or agreement to commit a crime and which step or act is done in furtherance of the accomplishment of the object of the conspiracy. In other words, when of the 3 men, the one who goes out and buys a gun, which is legal to do, one goes out and gasses up the car, that's legal to do, but it is the step in furtherance of the conspiracy. All you need is one. In this case, there are 28 overt acts that are alleged in this conspiracy. Go on. Overt act need not be criminal or unlawful. Go ahead. It is, in this case, a conspiracy to commit any of 3 different crimes, and all you need to do is find one of them. Any of 3 different crimes that they agreed to do. One is child abduction. In other words, the separation of Janet Arviso from her children. Go ahead. A person took, enticed away, kept or withheld, or concealed a child. No right of custody. Malicious, which means bad. That's all that means. And number 4, a specific intent to detain or conceal the child from the lawful custodian. This was what happened. And this actually, remember, I said the crime doesn't have to be completed at all? It's simply that they intend to do it. This crime was completed when they told her she could leave Neverland, but her children are not leaving, and she was so scared that she felt the need to leave. This crime was actually committed at that time. Go to the next one. Definition of keeps, or withholds. Retains physical possession whether or not the child resists or objects. In other words, these kids were happy to be at Neverland. That's not, it's a question of whether the mother has the right to have these children. To entice, the definition of that is, to allure, to attract, to draw, or to lead away by exciting hope or desire. In other words, draws these kids away with the promise that there was something fun to do, but separating the kids from the mother. It does not necessarily include any domination. Detain means to delay, to hinder, or to retard. It does not necessarily include force or menace. The second crime that we're dealing with here is false imprisonment. Now, there was a lot of cross-examination of witnesses by Mr. Mesereau and even Mr. Sanger, where they asked such questions of, well, did you hear any screaming? Did you hear anybody calling for help? As they walked from the car, did you hear anybody calling for help? As they walked from the car, did you hear anybody calling for help? As they went in the building, did you hear anybody calling for help? That demonstrates a complete lack of understanding of what this case is all about, and this crime. Nobody was falsely imprisoned, but there was the allegation that they conspired to do so, that they wanted that. They wanted to keep this family at Neverland, and they wanted to take them to Brazil. Now, the question is, did a number of people get together and decide that they were going to tell Janet that her life was in danger, and her children's lives were in danger, and they used that as a means to isolate her and keep her from moving about at will? Whether or not it actually happened, we went through hours of cross-examination about all the opportunities she had to run away. That has nothing to do with this case. The ultimate was when we had that. The orthodontist on the witness stand giving testimony with a roadmap of Solvang, talking about all the different escape routes out of Solvang, and all the questions about, did you hear any screaming out of the office? Did you hear any yelling for help in the orth, as if Janet Arviso is going to leave her kids in the orthodontist seat with braces on and run through the streets of Solvang screaming? It simply has nothing to do with this case. The question is, did a number of people get together and decide that they were going to frighten her into believing that her children were in danger for the purpose of keeping them isolated at Neverland? That is false imprisonment. It is the intent to commit that crime. Whether it actually happened or not is completely irrelevant. False imprisonment. Intentional or unlawfully confined or detained another. By the time we got to that stage of talking about whether the locks were on the inside of the door of the orthodontist office or on the outside of the door of the orthodontist office, I was ready to come screaming from the courtroom at that point. Number 2, that there was no consent in false imprisonment. That somebody was simply taken, was required to stay at a particular location. Number 3, accomplished by force or threats that are either express or implied. These were express threats. They told her her children were in danger of dying, that there were killers out there. And that has been corroborated by that tape that we recovered from Brad Miller's office. Go ahead. Extortion. This deals with taking from her a value, and it was under threat or fear. Go ahead. A person obtained tangible or intangible property or other thing of value from a victim. Go ahead. With consent. Consent induced by wrongful use of fear. Fear. Specific intent to wrongfully use fear to induce victim to give up their property. What constitutes fear? Go ahead. Definition of property in this case. What are we talking about? The use of fear to have them give up their own likeness, which in this case was a very valuable object. Everybody who testified in this case as to what went on in the early morning hours of the 20th of February for this video acknowledged that this was done for profit. That video was worth millions of dollars to somebody. But it was taken from the people who actually were entitled to it. And that was the Arviso family, and that was done by means of fear. The threat that there were people who would harm her and her children if they didn't do this particular project, that is extortion. In this particular case it was a crime that was actually accomplished. They certainly intended to do it, but in this case it was actually accomplished. Go on to the next. Alright, I'd like to show you a couple of documents very quickly. This is an interesting one. Go ahead and expand the sentence on here. This is a letter that had been emailed, and I believe it was Mark Schaffel to one of the Germans. But look at this statement that's on this letter. There's a possibility of a second show for the 25th or 26th for the same amount or more. As always, again, in my first plan, this would include Gavin and his mother, as well as a Michael Jackson interview. Go to the next page. The next page is an accounting of the amount of money that was going to come from this production, and that amount of money came to about $3.2 million. They were planning on using this production in a very profitable way. They were planning on using Gavin and his mother, Janet Arviso, for their profit. They had no intention on giving them a penny. Go to the next, please. No. Sorry. This is an exhibit of a document that was signed by Janet Arviso on the 7th of February. This was while they were in Florida. That top line, as she said, it was a blank piece of paper when she signed it. When you take a look at this document, that makes sense. The writing is typed in, it's well above the signature. It's certainly consistent with the fact that she signed a document that had no paper, sick, on it. If you look at the writing below it, Mrs. Arviso also learned that Devlin and Starr may have been on TV without their consent. Please send it back accordingly. Do you know what this document does? This document gives Michael Jackson the authority to include Janet Arviso in his lawsuit in England to take Living with Michael Jackson off the air, because she's the one with standing to do it. She's the one who has children for whom she did not give consent for them to be on it. Michael Jackson needs Janet Arviso's signature to effectively pursue that litigation. Not the other way around. This is a fraudulent document. The signature on the bottom was transposed. In other words, a copy of her signature was made from another document, it was pasted on, and then a Xerox was made, and then somebody wrote, and, look, it's in the third person. And in that bottom paragraph, Miss Arviso also learned, whereas in the top paragraph, it's, I confirm, first person. This is a fraudulent document, and it was used to be able to affect her inclusion in this lawsuit in England. And even David Legrand on the witness stand has so acknowledged. Go ahead. This is a document containing the expenditures of money. Can we see this? Can we blow it up? Go ahead. This is incoming money from Fox Studios on the 13th. This is an advance on what this production was going to be, $750,000. On the 20th, the day before the production, it was $750,000. We're up to $1.5 million. On the next one, an incoming wire. This is the day after the production, of $1.5 million. They're now up to $3 million. Go ahead. And finally, Alfred Haber, this deals with the incoming money from overseas, another $500,000, and another $500,000 5 days later. $4 million they got on the production of the Take Two, the one that Michael Jackson was going to include the production of the Arvisos as well, but frankly, he couldn't get it done in time because she refused to go back to Neverland. Go ahead. Hale Lane means that there was. This is the money to David Legrand. He gets $80,000. Go ahead. This is for Neverland Valley Entertainment. That means Mark Schaffel. He gets $150,000 for his involvement. Joe Marcus gets $35,000. He's the ranch manager. And this is on the 14th. This is before. You know, and this goes into his account. Joe Marcus is the one who put the notations, do not let Gavin leave the property. Remember that? On the 19th? Remember what they said about that? Well, do not let Gavin leave the property was because he drives an SUV. That's nonsense. That notation went on 1/2 hour after Hamid Moslehi arrived to do that video. They wanted to make sure that family was there to do that video. Go to the next one. Neverland Valley Ranch. That's Michael Jackson. $60,000. Go ahead. Garrigus and Garrigus. Look at this. On the 14th, Garrigus and Garrigus. Mark Garrigus worked for him for 7 days and got $70,000. It's not over yet. Go ahead. Hale Lane, that's the attorney, Legrand, $40,000. Ken Finkelstein is the attorney in New York, represents Michael Jackson. He's managing the money. This is the account from Fire Mountain. This is the money that came into that account that had been created, a corporate structure that had been created to be able to deal with the money that came from the production of Take Two. Ken Finkelstein is an attorney representing Michael Jackson. With Michael Jackson's knowledge and approval, $2 million goes to him for his management on behalf of Michael Jackson of that production. Go to the next one. Hale Lane, another $30,000. Go ahead. Alan Whitman is his accountant, $150,000. That's what goes to pay the creditors. That's it. He owes $10 million to his creditors. That's what goes for that. Go ahead. Another document in here. This is the demonstration of the money, of the $2 million that went to Finkelstein in New York. Another $41,000 to Garrigus and Garrigus. At this point we're up to $110,000. Another $70,000 to Garrigus and Garrigus. This is now $180,000 to Mark Garrigus. This is all within the first 3 weeks of his representation of Michael Jackson. Do you remember his testimony here? Do you remember when I asked him how many conversations he had with Michael Jackson? One that he had, on the first day he was there. He does not remember the content of that conversation. Remember that? When I asked him about conversations with anybody else, he had no recollection of any of them. Conversations with Mark Schaffel, conversations with Dieter or conversations with Ronald Konitzer, conversations with Casio. None of them did he remember, none of them did he take notes on, none of them did he keep notes on, none of them he could say in court. He got $180,000 in his first 3 weeks of representation of Michael Jackson and can't sit up here and represent to you one single conversation he had and adamantly denies that he ever had a conversation with Michael Jackson. Adamantly denied that he ever knew that this family was staying at Neverland. Adequately denied that he knew anything about a trip to Brazil. Adamantly denied that he knew anything about passports. Mark Garrigus, who stood up here and testified, anything about ever being told by an attorney representing Janet Arviso, that there was a demand for her passport, her birth certificate, original certified copies, and visas to New York. She had an absolute right to be concerned about them being in possession of her passport. An absolute right. And Dickerman had an absolute right to demand it. And he sent 6 letters to Mark Garrigus, and we presented them. And every one of those letters we corroborated and confirmed that they had been, the first one delivered, hand-delivered to Mark Garrigus, and 5 additional letters sent by fax, and we provided the proof that the facsimile had been delivered. In all 6 of those letters he makes a demand that the passports be returned. Mark Garrigus says, I knew nothing of the passports. I knew nothing of the visas. I knew nothing of the trip to Brazil. I had no conversation with Michael Jackson, certainly not that I recall. I took no notes of anything. I don't remember anything of any conversation with anybody else. All I knew was that Janet Arviso was trouble, and I said, you need to do something about that. I said to him, well, when did you first learn that they were living there for the better part of 5 weeks? That these children were staying in his room? That these children were about the last of a succession of boys who had been living in his room, sharing his room and in fact sharing his bed? And his answer, I knew nothing about that. Even the production of Living with Michael Jackson, the reason that he had been retained, that production itself he said he didn't watch for weeks and had never read the transcript. Did not know about the content of the phone conversation that was recorded by Brad Miller. Had never seen that transcript either. What exactly was he paid $180,000 for over a 3-week period? Because if you believe him in his testimony, he is both the most incompetent lawyer who ever occurred and the most uninformed. And that is not Mark Garrigus. That's not his reputation. And that means when he testified that he did not know anything about those passports, even though they were in his vault, and had been in his vault for over a year, in a law office that had a protocol set up to be able to deal with evidence being deposited into that vault, I didn't know it was there. I didn't know who got it. I didn't know who put it in there. Nobody signed for it. It just happened to be there. This is the case of the people versus Michael Jackson. This isn't the case of John Doe being charged with drunk driving. This is the case of people versus Michael Jackson. There is nobody who is going to be able to convince you that when 4 passports, 4 birth certificates and 4 visas are delivered to Mark Garrigus' office involving who? The victim in this case and his mother, his brother and his sister, that he did not know about that. Go ahead to the next one. $180,000. Mark Garrigus' testimony before you was simply not true. Now, why was Mark Garrigus testifying there? He was there to testify that his investigator, Brad Miller, told him that Janet Arviso asked for money. You have to simply not believe that. Because Brad Miller, one thing he's capable of doing is running a telephone wire and running a tape recorder. And if, in fact, she had ever asked him for money, we would have a tape of that. They never even put Brad Miller on the witness stand. And you have to disbelieve Mark Garrigus when he says, that's what Brad Miller told me. And that is the only testimony that came in, 3 months of trial, that actually has somebody saying Janet Arviso asked Michael Jackson for money. Nobody else has said that at any time. This is a document that was sent to Yolanda and Raymond Trujillo. They were the landlords of the Soto Street address. That document right there. The reason I'm showing it to you is, I want you to look at that signature. Go to the next one. Again, to Yolanda and Raymond Trujillo. This is about moving them out of that apartment. Mr. Garrigus said, we paid for it because they wanted to keep tabs on her. The answer to that is no, they didn't. They moved them out of that apartment because they wanted to ship them off to Brazil and Mr. Garrigus was part of that plan. Again, look at the signature over, Janet Arviso. Now go to the next one. The 2 top are the 2 signatures you just looked at. The bottom one is actually her signature. She never signed those authorizations to have her property moved out of that apartment. Those are forgeries. Just like that document on the 7th of February that was done in Florida that included her in that civil suit. Go to the next one. This is a document, and as we blow up the portion in here that I want you to see, it shows Janet Arviso at 11,520 Trent. The N is obscured in this photograph, but you can actually see it in the document, which is in evidence. 11520 Trent Avenue, Trent Court in Calabasas, is an address that does not exist. Does not exist. Go to the next one. Alright, before I get to that, let me talk a little bit more about what was going on in terms of Mark Garrigus, Brad Miller and all of the others.
Counsel, since you shifted, it's time for a break.
Okay, we'll do that.